Welcome to the deep dive. We dig into the sources, pull out the key facts, and hopefully make history a bit more engaging. Today we're tackling a really massive transformation. How Japan, the land of samurai and shoguns, went from this isolated feudal state to a major industrial power. And remarkably quickly, too. It's almost hard to grasp a whole nation deciding to redesign itself. How does that even happen? So our mission in this deep dive is to unpack the Meiji Reforms. That's roughly 1868 to 1912. We want to look at the pressures, internal and external, that sparked it all, the huge changes across society, and the legacy, both the good and the more complicated stuff.
Exactly. It's quite a story. We'll start by setting the scene. What was Japan actually like before the reforms, under the Tokugawa Shogunate? Then we'll get into that external shock, the foreign powers arriving, that really forced the issue and led to the Meiji Restoration. After that, we'll break down the reforms themselves: politics, economy, military, society, education, even law. It was comprehensive. And then we can sort of zoom out and compare Japan's path to other places trying to modernize around the same time. And finally, touch on what it all means today.
Okay, let's dive in. Segment 1, Japan before the reforms. So the Tokugawa Shogunate, 1603 to 1868. What's the picture? You mentioned feudal, highly stratified society.
Very much so. Politically, it wasn't really one unified country in the way we think of it now. Power was with the shogun in Edo, that's modern Tokyo. But beneath him, you had over 250 semi-autonomous domains, the hahan, each run by a local lord, a daimyo. And society, rigid, a strict four-class system, samurai warriors on top, then peasants, artisans, and merchants at the bottom, very little moving between classes.
And this isolation policy, Sakoku, how did that work?
Right, Sakoku. For over 200 years, Japan deliberately cut itself off. Trade was incredibly restricted. Only the Dutch and Chinese were allowed, and only through the port of Nagasaki. Now, this did bring peace internally for a long time, but the downside? Stagnation. Big time.
How so?
Well, the economy was mostly agrarian, based on rice taxes paid by peasants. But the tax system was fixed, while the economy, well, it changed slowly. This meant samurai, who were paid in rice stipends, saw their real incomes fall over time. They became impoverished.
Ah, so the warrior class was losing out financially.
Precisely. And meanwhile, peasants faced hardship too. We have records of over 1,400 peasant revolts just in the last 60 years or so of the shogunate. It put huge strain on the government's finances.
So you've got declining samurai income, peasant unrest. What else?
You also had discontent among lower-ranking samurai who felt stuck, and the merchant class who were getting wealthier but had zero social status. And then there were intellectual currents bubbling up, ideas like Sonaju.
Revere the emperor, expel the barbarians.
Exactly. This gained traction as people started seeing the shogunate as, well, weak, unable to handle the pressures.
Which made them particularly vulnerable when something unexpected happened from the outside.
Incredibly vulnerable. And that brings us to segment 2, the foreign shockwaves. 1853, Commodore Matthew Perry.
The black ships.
The black ships. Imagine these huge steam-powered American warships just appearing in Edo Bay after centuries of relative seclusion, demanding trade.
It must have been terrifying, a complete shock to the system.
Absolutely. It instantly showed Japan how far behind it was technologically and how vulnerable it was to, frankly, being colonized like other parts of Asia.
Classic gunboat diplomacy, you called it.
Textbook case. Perry basically forced Japan's hand. They had to sign the Treaty of Kanagawa in 1854.
And that was the end of Sakoku.
Pretty much. And it opened the floodgates. Soon, Japan was signing a whole series of what they called unequal treaties with Western powers. These treaties gave foreigners special rights, like extraterritoriality, meaning they weren't subject to Japanese law, and fixed low tariffs on imports, which hurt local industries, very similar to what happened to China after the Opium Wars.
So shogunate looked completely powerless.
Totally. Their inability to resist just fueled that Sonaju movement we talked about. Anger turned into action.
Led to civil war.
Yep, the Boshin War, 1868 to 69. Reformist domains, particularly Satsuma and Chushu, rose up and overthrew the Tokugawa Shogunate.
Which brings us to the Meiji Restoration itself, 1868.
Right. Emperor Mutsuhito, who we know by his reign name, Meiji, meaning enlightened rule, was formally restored to power.
But it wasn't really the emperor running things day to day, was it?
No, the real power shifted. It went to a small group of mostly young, ambitious samurai from those victorious domains, a modernizing oligarchy. And they had a very clear goal.
Which was?
Unify Japan, strengthen it fast so it could resist the West, avoid colonization. This was all laid out in the Charter Oath of 1868, seeking knowledge from all over the world.
To build a rich nation and strong army. Fukoku Kishe.
Exactly. That became the driving mantra. It wasn't just politics, it was a national survival strategy.
Okay, so segment 3, rebuilding the nation. They have this vision. Where do they start? Politics seems like the obvious place, a revelation from the top down.
Absolutely. First things first, dismantle the old feudal structure. In 1871, they abolished the Han, those domains, replaced them with prefectures governed by officials appointed from the center.
So consolidating power.
Hugely. Went from over 250 domains down to about 72 prefectures, brought the whole country under direct central control, and crucially, they got rid of all the old feudal class privileges. Samurai, daimyo, their special status was gone.
Wow, must have caused some friction.
Oh, definitely. We'll touch on resistance later, but the government pushed through. Then came the Meiji Constitution in 1889.
Modeled on Prussia, I read.
Largely, yes. It set up an imperial diet, a parliament, with an elected lower house. Sounds democratic, right? But voting rights were incredibly restricted initially. Only about 1% of men, taxpayers, could vote. And real executive power. It stayed with the prime minister and the cabinet, who were appointed by the emperor.
But really appointed by the oligarchs behind the scenes.
In practice, yes. And the emperor himself was declared sacred and inviolable, holding significant powers on paper. So scholars call it authoritarian constitutionalism. It looked modern, had a constitution, but power remained very concentrated at the top. National unity first.
Okay, so political power centralized. How did they fund the rich country part of Fukoku Pishe? Let's talk economics.
Right, money. A huge step was the land tax reform of 1873. This switched tax payments from a share of the rice harvest, which fluctuated, to a fixed cash tax based on the assessed value of the land. Initially 3%, later adjusted down a bit.
Predictable income for the government.
Exactly. Stable cash revenue is essential for planning and investment. And they did invest heavily. Building infrastructure, the first railway between Tokyo and Yokohama opened in 1872. Telegraph lines, a modern postal service. They also set up model factories, like the Tomioka silk mill, using imported French technology to, kickstart modern industry.
So the government was directly involved in starting businesses.
Initially, yes. But running these state enterprises got expensive. So starting around 1880, they began privatizing them, selling them off.
To who?
Often to politically connected investors, sometimes at pretty low prices. And this really fueled the rise of the zaibatsu.
The big family-controlled conglomerates. Mitsubishi.
Big names, yeah. They snapped up these state assets and expanded rapidly into banking, mining, shipping, everything. They became the powerhouses driving Japan's industrialization, a sort of state-guided capitalism.
Okay, so economy's getting revved up. What about the strong army part? Military modernization must have been key.
Absolutely critical. And the changes were drastic. The biggest was probably the conscription law of 1873.
Universal military service.
For all men aged 21, 3 years of service, regardless of your social class. This completely ended the samurai's traditional monopoly on fighting. It created a truly national army based on conscripts.
Was that popular?
Not universally. There were protests, the so-called blood tax riots. People didn't like losing their sons to the army. But again, the state pushed it through.
And they looked abroad for models here, too.
Oh, yes. The army was heavily influenced by the Prussian system, very disciplined, efficient. The Navy looked to the British Royal Navy, the dominant sea power at the time. They brought in lots of foreign military advisors, set up modern military academies to train officers.
And did it work? Did this new military prove itself?
It did. Internally, it crushed the last major samurai uprising, the Satsuma Rebellion in 1877. That showed the old ways were truly over. And externally, decisive victories against China in 1894 and 95.
Huge shockwaves across Asia.
And then, incredibly, against Russia in 1904-05. An Asian power defeating a major European empire. Unprecedented. And you can see the priority military spending often took up more than a third of the national budget.
Wow. Okay, so politics, economy, military. What about the social fabric?
Yeah.
Tearing down the old class system must have had huge ripple effect.
Massive. The four-tier class system, abolished.
Yeah.
Feudal titles, privileges, gone. Samurai lost their right to wear swords in public in 76. Their stipends were converted into bonds, often not worth much.
So what happened to them?
Many had to find new roles. Some went into government, the military, business. Others really struggled to adapt. But for society as a whole, it meant much more freedom. People could choose jobs, move to cities. Urbanization took off. Even the Burakumin, the traditional outcast groups, were legally emancipated in 1871. Though, sadly, social discrimination didn't just disappear overnight.
And women. How did their roles change in this new Japan?
It's complex. The government promoted an ideology called Risai Kenbo.
Good wife, wise mother.
Exactly. The idea was that women's role was to be educated. And yes, education for girls became compulsory in 1872, but primarily to raise patriotic sons and manage a modern household efficiently, supporting the nation from home. At the same time, many young women, especially from rural areas, became essential workers in the new factories, particularly textiles.
But facing tough conditions.
Often very harsh conditions, long hours, low pay, and politically, women remained excluded. They couldn't even attend political meetings until after World War II.
Education seems like another cornerstone. Civilization and enlightenment. Bunmai Kaika.
Yes, a real drive for learning, initially very focused on the West. The 1872 Education System Order set up a national public school system. Universal education was the goal for boys and girls. Key institutions like Tokyo Imperial University were founded to train the new elite.
Yeah, the results.
Pretty stunning, actually. By the early 1900s, literacy rates were incredibly high, around 95% enrollment for boys in elementary school, over 90% for girls. Japan became one of the most literate nations globally, very quickly.
But it wasn't just about reading, writing, and Western science, was it? There's an ideological component, too.
Absolutely. The 1890 Imperial Rescript on Education really cemented this. It stressed Confucian values, loyalty, filial piety, and absolute obedience to the emperor. It was about creating patriotic, unified citizens, blending Western methods with traditional Japanese ethics.
Okay, one last area. The legal system. To be seen as modern by the West, they had to change their laws too, right?
Right.
Especially to get rid of those unequal treaties.
Exactly. That was a huge motivation. Japan basically scrapped its old legal system, the Ritsuri codes, which were based on ancient Chinese models. They adopted new codes inspired by Europe. The Criminal Code of 1880 drew heavily on French law. And the Civil Code, finalized in the late 1890s, was largely based on the German system. So Japan adopted a civil law tradition like much of continental Europe.
And new courts.
Yes, a whole new court system designed to be independent from the government, staffed by professionally trained judges.
And this worked. It helped end the unequal treaties.
It was crucial. These reforms demonstrated to the Western powers that Japan had a modern, civilized legal system. This allowed Japan to renegotiate. They ended extraterritoriality, foreigners being subject to their own laws by 1894, and they regained control over their own tariffs by 1911.
Huge symbolic and practical victories, showing they were now equals on the world stage.
Absolutely. It marked Japan's arrival as a fully sovereign, modern nation.
All right, let's move to segment 4, impact and global comparison. We've seen this whirlwind of reforms. What were the results, short and long term?
Well, short term. Centralized power, feudalism gone, rapid industrial growth, new infrastructure like railways absolutely exploding across the country, and stability. The new army proved effective at putting down internal dissent, like that Satsuma rebellion.
On long term.
Japan became a major power, full stop. Victory over China, then Russia, proved it militarily. It became an imperial power itself, annexing Taiwan, then Korea, and it had achieved that key goal of revising the unequal treaties, gaining full sovereignty.
But it wasn't all smooth sailing. You mentioned resistance.
No, definitely not. There were those samurai revolts early on, peasant uprisings against taxes and conscription. And as the parliament developed, political parties started pushing back against the oligarchs' total control. It wasn't a monolithic process.
Now, the comparison question is really interesting. Other empires were trying to modernize too, China, Russia, the Ottomans. Why did Japan succeed so spectacularly where others arguably didn't?
Great question. Let's take China's self-strengthening movement. It struggled. Why? Well, more conservative elites, powerful local interests resisting central control, and much deeper foreign interference than Japan faced initially. Their bureaucracy was perhaps too rigid. Japan had this maybe useful instability at the start that allowed new leadership from specific regions like Satsuma and Kyushu to take charge with a unified vision.
And Russia.
Russia did industrialize, state-led, like Japan. Think Trans-Siberian Railway. But the Tsar was far more reluctant to give up political power. Plus, Russia's sheer size and diversity made reforms harder to implement uniformly. It led to instability, eventually revolution. Japan was smaller, more homogeneous.
The Ottoman Empire. The Tanzimat reforms.
They faced enormous challenges. ethnic diversity, rising nationalism within the empire, constant pressure and territorial losses to European powers. Geopolitically, they were in a much tougher spot than relatively isolated Japan. And crucially, they never really achieved financial independence or fostered that same level of mass education and unifying nationalism that Japan managed.
So what were Japan's secret ingredients for success, if you like?
A few key things stand out. One, timing and learning. They saw what was happening to China and knew they had to act fast, learning from others' mistakes. Two, cohesive leadership. That Meiji oligarchy, despite internal rivalries, shared a core vision, reinforced by things like the Iwakura mission, where they traveled the world together, consistent direction. Three, societal adaptability. Japan's relative homogeneity and maybe a less rigid religious structure compared to some others allowed for quicker social change. And four, perhaps most important, strategic adaptation. That idea of wakanisai, Japanese spirit, Western techniques.
Picking and choosing.
Exactly. Selectively adopting Western tech and institutions, but fitting them into a Japanese context. Preserving cultural identity. Pragmatic, not just blindly copying. They were willing to adjust course.
It really is an incredible story of deliberate transformation, which brings us to segment 5, legacy and lessons. What's the long-term impact, and maybe the darker side, of this rapid modernization?
Well, the success is undeniable in many ways. Building that strong military and industry made Japan a major power, a colonial power even. And that success inspired others. Leaders in Turkey, China looked at Japan and thought, we can do this too. We can resist the West.
But there were downsides, unintended consequences.
Absolutely. That intense focus on military strength and nationalism baked into the education system, the Constitution, it paved the way for ultranationalism and aggressive expansionism later on.
Leading eventually towards World War II.
Many historians draw that line, yes. The structures and ideology created in the Meiji era had long, complex consequences. And domestically, there were social costs. Rapid industrialization led to pollution, terrible working conditions, especially in places like textile mills.
So the benefits weren't shared equally.
Not at all. You had growing inequality, rural poverty alongside urban growth, worker unrest. Early socialist ideas started to take root in response to that.
And scholars today still debate this, right? Can the Meiji model even be replicated? Was it unique?
There's huge debate. Was it specific to Japan's context, island nation, homogeneity, timing, or are there universal lessons? Critics also point to the authoritarian nature. It was top-down, a developmental dictatorship, some call it. Individual rights often took a backseat to state goals.
So prioritizing national power over liberal democracy.
That seems a fair assessment of the Meiji approach. So the lessons are mixed. It shows the power of unified leadership, strategic adaptation. But it's also a cautionary tale about unchecked nationalism, the risks of authoritarianism, and the need to balance growth with social justice, and increasingly, we'd say now, environmental concerns.
So wrapping up this deep dive, it's just an astonishing story. The Meiji Reforms saw Japan pull off this incredibly rapid transformation, driven by crisis, guided by a determined elite, rebuilding the nation from the ground up.
It truly proves rapid modernization is possible. But it forces us to ask, at what cost? The path to power also led towards militarism and conflict. Social progress came with inequality and exploitation. It's a powerful example of adaptation, yes, but its legacy is deeply complex. You can't ignore the trade-offs.
And that leaves a question for you, our listener. How do those choices, made over a century ago during the Meiji era, still echo in Japan today? And what can other nations, navigating their own paths to development, learn from Japan's intense, ambitious, and ultimately complicated journey? Maybe something for a future deep dive could be Japan's brief experiment with Taisho democracy that followed, or digging even deeper into how Meiji-era decisions influenced Japan's path into the Second World War. Lots more to explore there.